The sun was low and bleeding orange across the wide prairie when he first saw her standing at the edge of his land. The day had been long, and the dust of cattle still clung to his boots as he rode in. His ranch stretched quiet around him, the kind of stillness only evening could bring. Fences casting long shadows, the porch creaking in the cooling air, the scent of hay and horses heavy on the breeze. He had expected the usual silence to greet him, the kind he had lived with for years, but instead, there was a figure at the gate. She was clutching it as if it were the only thing holding her upright, her shoulders heaving as though she had run farther than her strength should have allowed. Her dress, once white, was dulled by road dust, hem frayed, sleeves torn at the edges. In her right hand, she held a battered suitcase that looked too light to hold much more than a change of clothes. Her hair had come loose from the braids that framed her face, strands clinging to cheeks streaked with tears and sweat. She looked like someone who had walked out of a storm, but hadn't left the storm behind. When his horse slowed to a stop a few paces away, she lifted her head, eyes burning with desperation so raw it cut through him. Her voice broke into the stillness, trembling but fierce enough to carry. "If you don't marry me, I won't be able to live." For a long moment, the rancher didn't move. The reins tightened in his hands as his chest rose and fell, dust drifting off the horse's mane. He had seen many strange sights on the frontier: broken wagons, starving travelers, men drunk on their own ruin. But this woman at his gate making her plea as if her life balanced on the words was something else entirely. He studied her quietly, the brim of his hat casting his eyes in shadow. The weight of her words hung in the dry evening air, daring him to dismiss them, daring him to laugh. But he didn't. He couldn't. There was no jest in her face, no trick in her voice. Only desperation and the faint spark of defiance in a soul that refused to give up. She gripped the suitcase tighter, knuckles white, as though ready to fight him if he refused. Her voice cracked again, weaker this time but still steady. "They've turned me out. I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. If you send me away, I'll die on the road before morning." She bit her lip, her chin trembling as she forced herself to keep her gaze locked on his. There was no shame in her eyes, only the painful dignity of someone who had been pushed past the limits of pride. The rancher swung a leg over and stepped down from the saddle, boots hitting the earth with a thud that echoed in the stillness. He didn't speak right away. His hand rested on the saddle horn, his eyes never leaving her. She straightened as much as her tired body allowed, holding his gaze even as tears welled fresh. "You don't know me," she said, her voice hoarse, "but I can work. I'll cook, I'll mend, I'll haul water, I'll help with the stock. Just don't turn me away. Let me stay. Let me live." Her words struck something deep in him. This land had taught him that survival was cruel, that sometimes men turned their backs on those who couldn't carry their own weight. He had done it himself more than once, but looking at her, dusty, trembling, yet still unbroken, he felt a pull he could neither deny nor explain. She wasn't begging for pity. She was fighting for her place in the world, clawing at whatever hope she could grasp. And she had chosen him, the lone rancher with a house too empty and a life too quiet. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft snort of his horse and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The woman's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He could see how close she was to collapsing, yet she stood there stubbornly, refusing to lower her plea into silence. Finally, he stepped closer, the dust crunching beneath his boots. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, looking down at her with steady eyes. "You know what you're asking?" he said at last, his voice low, roughened by years of speaking little. She nodded, clutching the gate tighter as though it could steady her. "I know. I'm asking you for my life." The honesty of it cut straight through him. No romance, no soft words, no illusions, only a bare, desperate truth. He drew in a slow breath, eyes flicking from her ragged suitcase to the raw hope in her gaze. He thought of the long nights he had spent alone, of the meals eaten in silence, of the echo of his own footsteps in a house that had never known laughter. He thought of the emptiness of a life bound only to soil and stock. And suddenly, her presence at his gate felt less like intrusion and more like a turning he hadn't seen coming, but perhaps had been waiting for. Still, he didn't answer right away. The weight of choice pressed on him like a yoke. He knew what the neighbors would say, how the town would whisper. They'd call him a fool, say he'd taken in trouble. But as the woman's lips trembled and her breath caught in her throat, he knew none of that mattered as much as the truth before him. She would not last alone. And for reasons he didn't yet understand, he didn't want her to try. Her voice broke again, barely more than a whisper now. Please. He let the silence stretch a little longer until the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, he removed his hat, ran a calloused hand through his hair, and set his eyes firmly on her. All right, he said at last. You'll stay. The relief that crashed across her face was almost painful to watch. Her shoulders sagged, tears spilling freely, her suitcase slipping from her grip into the dust. For the first time since he had seen her, she allowed herself to break, her hands covering her face as sobs shook her body. He didn't move to touch her. He only stood, watching her crumble with the same quiet steadiness with which he had watched her stand so fiercely before. And deep inside, beneath the layers of dust and silence that had built up around his life, something shifted. The prairie wind swept through the yard, lifting the dust and carrying her sobs into the wide horizon. The rancher bent down, picked up the suitcase she had dropped, and with a quiet nod toward the house, gestured for her to follow. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, lifted her chin once more, and stepped forward. Her boots left faint prints in the dirt beside his as she crossed the threshold of the gate, leaving the road and the shadows of despair behind her. The sun slipped lower, spilling gold across the land as they walked together toward the porch. And though not a single word of marriage had been spoken beyond her desperate plea, something unspoken bound them already, an agreement forged in survival, in dignity, and in the silence of a man who had just chosen not to turn away. The suitcase hit the dirt with a dull thud, and she sank to her knees as if her body had finally betrayed her spirit. Dust rose in a thin cloud around her, catching the fading sunlight in a haze of gold, clinging to her skirts, her hair, her trembling hands. She pressed her palms against the earth as though the ground itself were the last solid thing she could hold on to. Her shoulders shook, a broken sound escaping her throat, a sound not of weakness, but of someone who had fought too long against the tide and now had nothing left but pleading. The rancher stood above her, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. His chest tightened at the sight, though he kept still, hands rough and calloused against the leather of his reins. He had seen women cry before, at funerals, at farewells, in the back of churchyards where grief tried to hide. But this was different. This was a cry carved out of sheer survival, a sound that clawed at the silence of the prairie and demanded to be heard. She lifted her face to him then, streaked with dirt and tears, and the sun caught the wetness in her eyes until they seemed almost to burn. "I'll do anything," she said, voice raw, words scraping through her throat. "Anything you ask. Just don't send me away. Don't leave me to die out there." Her gaze flicked past him, toward the endless horizon, land that stretched unforgiving and empty, a world that swallowed those who walked it without shelter or protection. Her breath came uneven, like someone half drowned. "Please, I have nothing, no one. If you refuse me now, there's nowhere else for me to go." The rancher shifted, the dust crunching under his boot. His silence pressed heavy, but his eyes never left hers. She thought she saw doubt there, the hesitation of a man used to weighing everything against practicality. How much work another mouth would bring. What whispers would follow in town, whether she was worth the trouble. Her throat tightened as panic welled, and she pressed her fists into the dirt before her knees, her voice breaking into sobs. "If you don't marry me, I won't be able to live." The words burst from her chest again, sharper, louder, as if she needed him to hear them until they carved through his doubts. She leaned forward, almost collapsing at his boots, her hair spilling like dark waves across the dust. Her hands caught at the hem of his coat, not pulling, not demanding, but clinging as though the fabric were a rope, and she a woman dangling over the edge of despair. The rancher looked down at her, and for a moment the world seemed to still, the horses in the corral, the wind stirring the grass, Even the far-off cry of a coyote, all seemed to wait on what he would do. He could have pulled back, shaken her hands off, told her to stand on her own 2 feet. He had lived long enough to know how to harden his heart. But something about the way she knelt there, dust clinging to her tears, dignity breaking under the weight of desperation, yet still holding enough fire to demand her right to live, struck a chord deeper than reason. He crouched slowly, setting one knee in the dirt so his face lowered closer to hers. His hands, rough from reins and rope, hovered for a moment before resting lightly on her wrists, still clenched against his coat. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, the kind of voice that had weathered storms and knew better than to make promises lightly. "Enough," he said, not harsh, but firm enough to still her shaking. "I hear you." Her sobs slowed, though her breath still came fast. She searched his face, eyes wide, uncertain, as if waiting for him to finish with rejection. But he didn't. Instead, he drew her hands gently away from his coat and wrapped them in his own, holding them steady between them. Her fingers trembled, her knuckles scraped raw from travel, but his grip anchored them like iron. "You've carried yourself this far," he said, his eyes steady, unflinching. "That takes more strength than most men I've ever known. I won't turn you out now, not while I've got a roof to spare." Her lips parted, the breath catching in her throat. For the first time, the tension in her shoulders loosened, if only a little. She let her hands rest in his, no longer clutching but holding as though she'd found something solid enough to believe in. A sob rose again, softer this time, breaking into a laugh that wasn't joy, but relief. The fragile kind that came after a storm when one realized they were still alive. The rancher released her hands slowly, as if testing whether she could stand on her own again. He rose to his feet, then extended a hand downward. She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her palm in his. He pulled her gently up, the strength in his arm lifting her with ease. When she was standing, the suitcase forgotten in the dirt behind her, she swayed unsteady. His hand remained at her elbow, steadying her. "Come on," he said quietly, nodding toward the porch. "You'll rest. Then we'll see what comes of this." She blinked, tears still wet on her cheeks. "You mean you'll let me stay?" His jaw tightened, his gaze fixed steady on hers. "I said I wouldn't send you away, didn't I? My word stands." The smallest smile flickered through her exhaustion, a fragile light that cut through her sorrow. She nodded, clutching her arms around herself as though holding in what strength she had left. They walked side by side across the yard, her steps faltering but determined, his stride slow enough to match hers. The setting sun threw long shadows ahead of them, 2 figures crossing into a house that had long been empty of such company. At the porch steps, she paused, glancing back at the suitcase still lying in the dust. He followed her gaze, then strode back, lifted it with one hand, and carried it without a word. She watched him, and for the first time since arriving, her tears slowed, replaced by something else, something like trust, though too new and fragile to name. Inside, the house smelled of pine wood and leather, simple and spare. He set the suitcase down by the doorway, then turned to her. She stood just inside, the light from the setting sun outlining her form against the wide open world she had come from. Dust still clung to her, her hair tangled, her dress worn thin. Yet, in that moment, she looked less like a stranger on the verge of collapse, and more like someone who had crossed a threshold into a life not yet written. The rancher nodded toward the table. "Sit. You need food in you." She moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid the ground might give way beneath her. But when she lowered herself into the chair, the tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. He busied himself at the stove, his movements quiet but sure. She watched him in silence, tears drying on her cheeks, her breath steadying as the warmth of the room wrapped around her. For the first time in days, maybe longer, she felt something stir that had been nearly beaten out of her on the road. The faint, flickering spark of hope